Sandra Medrano-Arroyo, thank you so much for joining us on Highest Aspirations. This has been a long time coming.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure being here this morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You're one of, I think, maybe 4 or 5 at this point, Ellevation people that we've interviewed, which is really fun. Getting to know you kind of on a different level and sharing your expertise, which you have a lot of. So I'm excited to dive in.
Thank you. It's exciting.
Yeah. So I know that you're a former multilingual learner from New York City with parents from Puerto Rico and Cuba. And your personal history, I usually don't start here, but your personal history seems to have really greatly influenced you and your professional trajectory. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Kind of give us the short version of how you got to where you are now?
Absolutely. So it's really funny because I never really thought about it until you put it that way, right? I knew that I had always wanted to help people. I know that as an ELL in New York City with Spanish-speaking parents, I know that I struggled. I didn't obviously realize that at that moment, but later on in my educational life, I looked back and realized, I don't think that was the right way. I don't think putting me in a special ed class was the right way for me to learn English, but I obviously did learn English. It did happen. But as I look back on my life, I do realize that even as a parent, I made sure to raise my children bilingually and biculturally, because I did learn English in school, but my parents made sure that I never lost my Spanish. Right. So at home, I only spoke Spanish. We only read in Spanish. I communicated in writing with my grandparents in Spanish. And so I was raised bilingually and biculturally, and I made sure to do the same for my kids, because I did realize the gift that it is. But when I think about the personal experiences and how it's impacted my life, my professional life, I think that one of those eye-opening moments was when I found myself recruiting bilingual teachers for the school district. And I realized that students were not seeing themselves and their culture represented in the classroom. Mm-hmm. I realized that the academic, the social, cultural challenges that they were facing, they and their families were facing, were not being met. I realized that Spanish-speaking students, or any native-speaking student aside from native English, were not given the opportunity to maintain their language. And so that, to me, that was wrong. I had to do something about that, right? And that's when I truly decided I need to become an advocate for our kids and our family. And so, unfortunately, the majority of our students that speak another language are not provided the opportunity to keep it. More and more we're seeing bilingual programs pop up across the nation, which is exciting and inspiring. But unfortunately, for so long, kids were not allowed to speak their language in school. And that's a huge part of who they are.
Yeah, what strikes me is that you had an experience perhaps that was not the norm or a common experience as a child with your parents making sure that you kept that language, where many people, I mean, myself, I remember, my father is from Greece, and when he was growing up, it was speak English, only speak English. And for him, that was ingrained in him. And luckily, he was at a point where he had already learned enough Greek that he was going to be bilingual. But that died with him. I never learned it because it was never prioritized for me. It was a different situation. But for you to have that influence and be able to communicate and use your home language and value it, right? And then see in schools, when you started working in schools, that wasn't happening, and understanding the value of it. That's such a great connection to have. And just the empathy that you must have brought with you must have been really, really important for you and for the students that you served.
It gave me an opportunity, honestly, to be able to have very empowering conversations with family members, because oftentimes as parents, as your father said, you've got to speak English. Many parents, their mentality is they've come to this country for a better life so that they can give a better life to their kids. And so learning English is their top priority.
That's the key, right?
He'll learn Spanish at home, or he'll speak Haitian Creole at home, and he will on a social level. Right. So I always say that the greatest gift that we can give our children is bilingualism, but even a greater gift that we can give their families is that empowerment. And the empowerment can only come through the knowledge that they gain when they actually see the opportunities that being bilingual will bring their child in this country,
right?
And throughout the world, right? And so just as many administrators who I'm sure are going to listen to this podcast, I had a lot of Spanish-speaking parents resist that suggestion for their child to maintain their language in a dual language program, regardless of how many times I told them they're going to learn English.
Yep.
I promise you. But again, they're just wanting a better life for their child. And so in their mind, that's through English. English is the universal language.
Of course, it's well intended, right? But that's you get that through education and through lots of different family engagement strategies, which is a topic that we've covered, and I'm very tempted to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go back to bilingualism and dual language programs, because that's what I want to talk with you mostly about today. One thing that I really appreciated about your perspective, and something that I talk a lot about in the podcast, and I talked a lot about as a teacher, and I talked a lot about when I was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education doing a lot of research, is this gap between research and practice. And you and a lot of others, I think, really have the ability to bridge that gap. And so I want to kind of get into that a little bit. The Thomas and Collier study is a seminal piece in dual language research, but not all teachers, including me, really know a whole lot about it. And researchers don't necessarily understand, in some cases, how that actually plays out on a daily basis at school, or at least that's the perspective of many teachers who are looking at these folks like, you're in your university or your ivory tower doing all this research, but how does it apply here? Could you explain what it tells us and how you've seen it play out, particularly in the 14 years of experience that you had at Palm Beach?
Sure. So Thomas and Collier, they're the gurus of dual language, right? We all look to Thomas and Collier always. They're amazing. I never tire of hearing their conversations. And
you can tell just the way that you're expressing it, you could tell the happiness.
They're fabulous. And what's fabulous, not only them personally, but their groundbreaking studies, because for the longest time you have different research studies, but for them to have been able to provide a longitudinal study of thousands of kids in the program is amazing. And the comparison that they have between all the different types of programs that districts use to serve our multilingual learners, that's very hard to come by. And I believe they were probably the very first ones to do anything like that, which is why we always look at their graph. But they were able to demonstrate that most students, after anywhere from 4 to 7 years of dual language education, those bilingual students outperform their monolingual peers in all subjects on standardized tests. Mm-hmm. That's huge for a program to do for our ELs, right? And their data also showed that students participating in a strong dual language program, and we'll talk about a strong program, what that truly means in a little while, I'm sure, but one that runs a K-12 path, was the only program that was proven to fully close that academic achievement gap. Again, huge, because there's not a lot of programs that have that claim to fame, right?
Right.
And then what I love the most, obviously, is that their data included not only the English learners, but it also included their native English speakers.
Which I think is so important. Yep, and powerful.
Absolutely. We go back to the gift of bilingualism, which I say. And so when I think back of all the years that I was in Palm Beach County, right, and all the different roles that I played within dual language programs, after those, I think it was really 16 years that I was in dual language. I had the opportunity to see our dual language students begin to reach grade level proficiency in a second language in as little as 4 years. Again, our English learners in traditional classrooms and different types of programs of models were not achieving English proficiency at that rate. It took them a little longer, about 1.5 years or 2. Again, there's lots of variables that play into that, but the program itself, I know, has a lot to do with it. I saw kids graduate with a seal of biliteracy who were able to move fluidly between 2 languages at any given time on an academic level, on a social level. And they maintained their English. It was perfect. They learned their second language. And once again, they outperformed their peers. And I think that, one of the takeaways from that research is that children really need time to learn how the language works. District administrators really need to look at different types of models and the demographics that they have, and go out on a limb sometimes, take that leap of faith and implement a program that perhaps at that moment doesn't, they may not wrap their heads around exactly how will this look in a couple of years, in testing grades, as they move into middle school.
Right.
It is a leap of faith, but the data will prove it. I saw it in our school district.
Yeah, I mean, and thanks for breaking that down in such a simple way, because if you're like me and you're reading through that research, it can be a bit of it can be daunting. Yeah, but not a bit for me. I need it broken down like you just did. So I'm sure there are many people that find that helpful as well, because having that research and having that proof in front of you when you take that leap of faith, which it is, right? And it seems in many ways to many people, particularly those who aren't well educated in this field through no fault of their own, if they're an administrator, it seems like a leap of faith, and it might seem even counterintuitive. But to have that research and to have that data is key. And again, thanks for breaking that down. And the other thing that you and I have talked a little bit about is the goals being broken down in what are called the 3 pillars. So high academic achievement, bilingualism and biliteracy, and sociocultural competence, which you kind of, I think, alluded to a little bit in what you were talking about before. But could you discuss how those 3 things play out and you talked about good dual language programs. So where's that distinction made, and how do those 3 pillars play in?
So there's this great visual of 3 pillars, right, holding up what appears to be a coliseum, right? And so I think back and I said, there's so many structures in place after hundreds of years that are still in place, but why are they still there? Because the foundation was a strong foundation. And the same thing happens with your dual language program. So when I say effective, sustainable, strong dual language program, it's because it has to be built on those 3 pillars. And the 3 pillars are high academic achievement in both program languages, bilingualism and biliteracy, and then sociocultural competence. But it's more than just saying, these are our 3 pillars. It's making sure that every decision, instructional, staffing, program structure, every single decision as a school administrator or a district administrator is taken with that in mind, that the research is actually looked at. I rely heavily throughout my years, and I still do in Ellevation. I rely heavily on the guiding principles for dual language education, which was released. The 3rd edition was their last edition, released a couple of years ago. The Center for Applied Linguistics and a couple of incredible authors, including our very own dual language advisor, Dr. Jose Medina, was one of the authors of that. And if there's any doubt, I'd always pull out the book when I sat with the district administrator and tell them, let's see what it says. Here's what we're aiming for.
Right.
And it's hard when we say high academic achievement in 2 languages. What does that truly mean? Because we don't teach every subject in every language. So how do you attain that, and what has to happen behind the scenes? For example, teachers collaborating, planning together, understanding themselves, the similarities and the differences between 2 languages. And now how do you teach that? How do you explicitly teach that to our kids so that they learn it and eventually they become the owners of that and they can start to see those similarities and differences? It takes a lot of conversation, a lot of collaboration, like I mentioned, and a lot of reading of the research.
Right.
So,
yeah, what strikes me, what I've been thinking about is you've been speaking about this foundation in particular and all of the collaboration and conversations and how it needs to be baked in, and there needs to be some backwards planning. And you mentioned the seal of biliteracy, which perhaps is a way to kind of get people there and maybe an impetus for districts to kind of start these conversations. We've talked about the seal of biliteracy. We've talked about co-teaching and co-planning. We've talked about all these little pieces, but what I really appreciate about what you're doing is you're sort of zooming out, right? And talking about what you need to do to really get all those things in place. I'm really thinking about all the conversations that I've had on this podcast and in many different places about the little minute details that are really, really important that a teacher does, or that an administrator does, or that whoever, a student does. But in those little minute details, there needs to be a framework around them, right? And what you're describing, it seems to be kind of like the zoomed out picture of what all those elements fit into. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Maybe you could say it a little bit better.
That does. Yeah, I guess I zoomed out of our our graphic is what I just
Well,
did.
which is a good thing though, right? Because you can't, like, all these little pieces that I feel like, and this is what I thought as a teacher many times, and I taught high school Spanish, right? So I wasn't teaching I was teaching students to learn Spanish in an academic setting. And I always felt like, boy, if the system was set up in a different way, I could really, really make some great changes. And I was given a tremendous amount of freedom as a teacher, which I always appreciated, but there were still limitations. So with this framework in place, right, I feel like all those little elements now are able to be, they're able to be part of the recipe as opposed to just ingredients sort of sitting on the shelf. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know, one of the questions that I've always used myself, and anyone who's worked with me knows that I always ask that question, well, what does this look like? So when we say bilingualism and biliteracy, well, what does that look like? I know what it is. I can read about it, but what does it look like in your classroom, in your school, in that district? Because it'll always look a little different. You know, it's funny you mentioned ingredients, because years ago I did a PD. I used to do a PD, and it was about taking, you have basic ingredients for a cake, right? So we've got basic ingredients that are necessary for a dual language program, which are our 3 pillars. But then every school adds a little flavor. Maybe you like more chocolate. Maybe I want my filling to be dulce de leche. You know, we're all going to add something a little different to it, because that's what fits the demographics of the school, the culture of the school. You know, having that community input also is huge. And as district administrators and school administrators, we need to listen to them. They're our greatest advocates for these programs. And so every one of them will look different, but truly stepping back and saying, okay, so yes, I've got to ensure that our kids are bilingual and biliterate, but what does that look like? What does that mean for us?
Yeah, I think that's great. It's highly contextualized depending on where you are. I mean, in so many different ways. I really like that recipe and ingredient model. I'm sort of channeling our colleague, Daniel Sabinski, who's the master of making those kinds of analogies. If anybody who's
You'll be
listening,
very proud.
right? I hope so. I hope I didn't let him down. Okay, so another key element of all this, right, that is a challenge is, you know, you've just mentioned lots of the ingredients and lots of the research that makes this work and makes it tick, but we have a problem with finding teachers, right? That is, I've talked to a lot of people about that, where it's something we're going to talk about in our impact conference that's coming up in December. How have you seen viable solutions to this problem, finding these highly qualified teachers to do this kind of work? I mean, I was never trained as a high school teacher to do any of this work, even as a language teacher.
Funny, because that's how I entered the school district that I worked at, as a bilingual personnel specialist. It was my job to go out there and find anyone who spoke a different language and represented the demographics of our school district, because at that moment, you know, it was a pivotal time, and our demographics were really taking a turn, and we simply didn't have the number of teachers that we needed in the classrooms that truly represented our demographics. And I think that, you know, when we talk so much about equity, and I think that that's one of the key pieces in a school when you're recruiting, to ensure that you've got individuals there that kids can bond with, that kids understand, that understand the challenges that our kids and their families are going through, whether they were born here or came to us from another country. And that is so difficult, so difficult. And the pandemic hasn't made it any better at all, unfortunately. There were a lot of things, and I know a lot of districts do a lot of things that are so out of the box, and I love reading about it. I can tell you that the very one thing that has to be a priority in a school district is that the entire district needs to understand that that's a priority. So that's everything from the financial department to the teachers union, to professional development, to the curricular department, and of course, HR. Everyone needs to understand the benefits of a dual language program. Everyone needs to understand that data and how our kids outperform their peers after just a couple of years in the program.
Yeah, all kids again, all kids.
Yeah, they need to understand what the curriculum looks like, because all of these things, first of all, if HR reps don't understand the demands of the job and the specific level of proficiency that a teacher needs to have also to teach in the program, they're not going to select the right candidate. Upon not selecting the right candidate and having other issues come into play, for example, curriculum or there's no bilingual stipend, or any of those other factors, now you're looking at retention. Now, how do you keep these teachers?
Right.
You got someone who's bilingual, but she's going to go down, a couple of exits on our turnpike and maybe go somewhere else, because they do offer those types of financial incentives. So that's why I said that it's really important that the district as an entire, we'll say community, right? Get together and truly analyze every single part and division and make sure that everyone's aligned with that priority of recruiting. And then as I think back, creating partnerships with local universities, that was huge for us. We were able to work together with grants and take our bilingual paraprofessionals, and those who were interested in furthering their degree, we were able to pay with that grant for them to continue their studies and become certified. There was also financial incentives of, well, if you're temporarily certified and you need to take a certification exam, the district will pay for you. We'll pay for your exam, because those exams they're not reasonably priced, let's say.
Right. They're not.
They're expensive. And so that's a nice financial perk to be able to tell somebody, go ahead and sign up for the exam. We've got your back. We want you to stay with us. It was also a great opportunity for individuals who had come to our county and were professionals in their own country to be able to bring them in and say, here are the steps needed for you to take your experience, your qualifications from your country, and we're going to help use that, tap into that, so that then you can help us and be teachers in our classrooms. So a lot of those things happen because of the partnerships with the universities. And then, of course, we have Grow Your Own, which are so popular right now, thankfully, because, again, tapping into the students that we produce in a district where after 24, 25 years, we have so many kids who have graduated with a seal of biliteracy, proficient in both languages, to tap into that, to give them a contract when they graduate high school and say, hey, finish school. We're here for you. Come back to your community.
Yeah.
That's great. You walk away with a high school diploma and you walk away with, a job contract already.
Right.
So there's a lot of different steps. And then, of course, there's always the visa sponsorship, which districts, I think, more and more are looking towards. There's a lot of companies also that provide that assistance to districts, because not only does it bring someone who knows the language, but it brings someone who is in tune with their culture. And so kids can obtain an even better understanding of a specific culture.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about all those things on the podcast. In fact, like the Grow Your Own programs, Amaya Garcia from New America has done a lot of work on that. She's going to be moderating our panel on this very topic, on teacher getting the right teachers and then retaining them. It's funny you mentioned the university partnerships, which is huge. And if you have a community where you're lucky enough to have a university there and you can create a partnership, even if it's not close, that's proven useful. Our own Christina Soprano, who was doing that in Rhode Island, actually, she came on the podcast before she was ever working with us, which is great to have her on board, because she was doing a lot of work with that. And then, those two seem to be, not to dwell too much on this topic, but I think it's really interesting, especially now. Those two seem to be pretty well received by everyone. The one that I've heard a variety of different things, and you just mentioned some positives about it, is the visa sponsorships, where the concern there, right, is that most of those people are going to end up going back to their home countries, so the retention can be tricky, right? But I see the positive there too. I mean, it's something that I always wanted to do as a teacher. I wanted to travel, on a I forget what they call it, I can't remember the name, but there was a way where you go and teach in another country, and then a teacher would come to your district to work. And something I always wanted to do, but I would have left. I would have gone to another school. And if I were a good teacher, say in wherever I was in Chile, and I had to leave, then they were stuck, and vice versa. Right. So it's tricky.
It is tricky. One of my responses in the district used to be that there is no telling when you hire someone here locally that they're going to stay with you for 3 years either.
Right. You're right. It's a good point.
At the end of the day, we don't know, because of so many other different factors, personal as well as professional, that we discussed in that other question. But The visa sponsorship, so there's two ways of doing it. You can have teachers come to you as exchange teachers and stay up to 3 or 5 years. Every state has different regulations around that. And, we had many of them fell in love and made a life here, and so you don't promote that, but you don't stop that.
Exactly. You can't. That's one thing that
on the contrary, you go to the wedding, you celebrate with them. And then you relish the fact that this teacher remained. But there are other districts that have, once again, that leap of faith, that commitment as a district, as opposed to commitment as a school, of saying, you know what, we're going to offer our visas. And if our teachers work out and their evaluations, for X number of years are satisfactory, we're going to offer them the chance to stay. And they put their parameters around that. Is it expensive? It is. But when you start looking at how expensive teacher turnover is, regardless, and that's here, recruiting here, then it really doesn't look that expensive after all. But it does take a huge effort on behalf of a district.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective there. I think you just kind of swayed me a little bit. I've heard a lot of people talk about the other side. And of course, just like everything else, it's going to have different sides and it's a debate worth having. But the personal piece is crucial. And like you said, while you don't promote, you just don't know what's going to happen with the teacher here, especially with the attrition rate that we see normally. So it's really interesting. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, it's highly contextualized to where you are and what you need. But having those three options that you just lined up as possibilities, certainly helpful. Okay, I could talk about this topic all day, but I want to continue on the trajectory that we had set. We talk a lot about asset-based learning and looking at multilingual learners as assets, and we talk about it generally, not just with dual language programs. But I'm optimistic about this sort of focus on equity and what we're seeing now. How have you seen dual language programs provide equitable access to educational experiences and support that asset-based approach to educating multilingual learners and really all learners? Like, where does that play out for you, and how does a dual language program specifically achieve those goals?
It's funny because having been involved in dual language programs for so long, of course, I see the dual language programs as the easiest way to provide equitable access, the easiest solution to tapping into those incredible assets that our multilingual learners bring to our schools. And it's funny, but you turn around and say, how do other people don't see that?
That's right. So that's right. It's such a devil's advocate question, but there are, like, someone's listening, and it's probably not somebody listening to this podcast right now. I worry that I'm preaching to the choir in this echo chamber a lot, but the person that's listening probably has to convince someone else of it. So take that perspective. How does somebody convince someone, a naysayer, that this is the path toward equity?
Absolutely. So let's start with the fact that one of the pillars we'll go back to our pillars, right? One of our pillars of the program is sociocultural competences. And so that ability to see those cultural differences in others as assets and not as something that needs to be tolerated, that's extremely important. Not only does that create for a more equitable school environment, but when we look at ourselves as a society, how different life might be if we saw each other as assets, regardless of what we bring to the table. And so a program like a dual language program that supports that asset-based approach, and as you said, to educate all learners, our multilingual learners, our SIFE kids, our newcomers, our native English speakers, provides that opportunity for teachers, for families, for students, stakeholders to receive and discuss culture education, which doesn't really happen much, unfortunately. There seems to not be enough time for topics of conversation such as those. But yet in a dual language program, that has to be a part of the program. You have to create school-wide language policies. Where do you speak Spanish? Unfortunately, that answer differs from school to school. Your language policy in a school that has a diverse demographic should be, you can speak Spanish anywhere, at any time, and it's always going to be welcomed, right? And so if that's not asset based, I don't know what
Yeah,
else
right.
could be, right?
Right.
And then again, creating that whole advocacy piece. So now we're teaching our kids to become advocates for each other. We're teaching our teachers that it's okay to have those conversations about culture and find out more about your kids and tap into that, and do so in a meaningful way, not just celebrating, bring in your favorite food or who's your favorite singer or bring in a poster of your country's flag. It's really going deep and getting to know what are the culture, what are the traditions of that culture, folklore, comparing stories between, our classics and classics from other countries.
Right.
How do they differ? And how are they the same? And so that's the beauty of a dual language program, because everyone is working together to strengthen the program while we're tapping into all of the assets that our kids and families bring.
Right. Yeah, you just brought something up that I actually want to get a little bit more specific on, and that's like embracing particularly biliteracy. And as somebody who, I had the pleasure of teaching AP Spanish language, but also AP Spanish literature and culture, which I remember very clearly when they told me in the summer that the person who was teaching the class was leaving and that they were asking me to do it. I remember being horrified because I was looking at this giant list of this rich literature starting way back, in Spain in like the 14th century with the Romances, and then going all the way to, the 20th century with Garcia Marquez and everything. And I was like, how am I going to? But anyway, I digress. It turned out to be one of the best professional experiences of my life. And when we were reading all of those works, right, in Spanish with students who were learning Spanish, I had a great relationship with some of the English teachers, and we were comparing those works. And it was such a beautiful and rich experience. And you know what? There were more similarities than there were differences. And the differences made it so beautiful and wonderful. So my question is, how do we get people to embrace that? Putting Faulkner and Garcia Marquez or Shakespeare and Quixote on the same level, first of all, in the same playing field, and using them to really promote that biliteracy piece. And this, I'm asking you, this is in relation to dual language, right? But this could really apply anywhere and in any kind of educational program, because being exposed to that authentic literature is amazing. I mean, I can't imagine somebody having to sort of break down rather than reading it. It was you can hear my voice, such an amazing experience. So how do we leverage that or pull that lever and get people to really appreciate those similarities and differences?
Wow. I could answer this question for the rest of the podcast now.
Yeah, go for it, because I could too. We don't have too many questions left, so you can take some time on this one.
Okay. Well, first of all, I love the fact that you and your teachers took that time to actually review the literature and note similarities and differences. Right? And I love the fact that you noticed that there were so many similarities. The beauty of creating biliterate children is that we are able to then dive into those differences, those similarities. This is great because your English teacher will cover that, but as the Spanish AP teacher, for example, you had to do a deep dive into what was different. Right. So nuances of the language, and just as we have Old English, well, we have words that are no longer used in Spanish either, that they transformed throughout the years and the centuries, and really looking at that is what helps to create that biliterate and bilingual person. And I think that one of the greatest ways that we can really have others embrace that biliteracy is putting kids, I would say the kids tell the best stories, right? So putting your students in situations in which they can showcase their skills. And so if we provide them with these opportunities, and again, I'm not talking a nice little show during the holiday break or the end of the year. I'm talking about creating community partnerships, for example, in which our kids are able to use their linguistic assets to enrich the community, to give back to the community. That's powerful because these kids will wear their school shirt or something that identifies them as a student of the district. And people will ask, where did you learn your Spanish? Or how did you keep your Haitian Creole? They tell the best stories. And so we tried to do a lot of that in our district. We had a collaboration, for example, with a museum here in the city, and our high school students became student docents. It takes a while to plan those things, and kids need a very specific level of proficiency. But regardless of their level of proficiency, they were all given that opportunity to become student docents, working with businesses so our kids could become student interns. You know, there's a lot of businesses that are not prepared for changing demographics. They have no bilingual staff.
Right.
Teaching isn't the only industry in which we're lacking bilingual people. Okay? It's everywhere. And so to be able to develop those internships with businesses, and our kids can do a work-study program and become interns, and again, tap into their bilingualism, that is huge. That will definitely convince the non-believers, we'll call them, that teaching in two languages is truly rigorous, but it's not easy. And our kids have gone through this program and they have succeeded, and those are going to be our global citizens.
What you're saying is so powerful. And when I hear and I hear it frequently, these kinds of, it's about community partnerships and getting students out there and filling a void that the community has. That is amazing for the student. And oftentimes as teachers and as educators and as advocates, we think about the students first, and we should. But what that is doing for the community, not only to help fill a void at a museum or at a store or whatever the case may be, but also in just creating a more, not only tolerance, but partnerships and collaboration, and seeing that the assets that people bring, it's so powerful. And it always brings me back to one of the first podcasts I think I had ever done for Ellevation. It was with a woman by the name of Donna Neary. She was from Lexington, Kentucky, and she worked, I tell this story a lot, so forgive me if you've heard this story and you're listening now, but I'm going to tell it again. She worked with students who were newcomers who were in danger of not graduating on time. They were going to age out. So she had this program called Accelerate to Graduate. I think it was called that. And she tells this story, and I'll find it and we'll link to it somehow. She tells this story about when these students were going to work with members of the Department of Public Works to help like spruce up a park, right? And they were in the park, they were creating this, I think it was like a grill or an oven or something where people could kind of cook outside. And this one young man who I don't remember where he was from, but he had done this in his home country, and they had created these clay things. And he looked at the gentleman who was a guy from the account of who I was speaking with, who didn't really have much experience working with newcomers and was probably living, in a bit of a silo and not had much experience with diversity. He then asked the student questions, was very patient with him, and the student answered and they worked together to create this new thing. I mean, what you're talking about is it creates those opportunities. They're not going to happen every single time, right? But they are going to happen enough where we're going to see change. And so you're talking about the structure, but like those stories, those that are happening on a daily basis when things like this are created, they're so powerful for both. I mean, for both people who are involved. I mean, I have to think that man, that his mindset maybe was changed in some way. He had an experience. He worked with somebody face to face who he normally would not. And I mean, what a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. It's a newfound respect for someone that he probably developed, and unfortunately, we all have our biases. And again, I can't speak for that individual, but so often we'll enter a conversation or a situation, and we have our biases. They may not be there at the forefront, but we have them. And to be able to go and experience that firsthand, not read about it, not hear about it, but experience it firsthand, suddenly that bias, you can begin to kind of, peel away those layers and realize, oh, wow, I was wrong. As an individual, I was wrong about somebody else.
Right.
Or I judged incorrectly, or, and I have limited myself from learning so much from others. And so I think those are very powerful and transformational moments.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I have learned a tremendous amount from you, Sandra, not only today, but in the time that I've been at Ellevation. But you have a way of being able to break things down, I think, in a way that people not only can understand, but then take hopefully and use to convince others that these kinds of changes need to happen. So I have to ask you, this is not a question that I ask everybody, but what brought you here? What brought you to Ellevation? I mean, this wealth of knowledge that you have has been so useful for us, but what made you make this change?
Well, anytime I've made a change in my life is always because I think of the greater good, right? So I was in a classroom and I loved what I was doing in the classroom. But then when I was offered to become an administrator of a school, I thought, oh, wow, I can make change on a bigger level, right? And then eventually I was at a district level. And so once again, I can make change on a greater level. And so the same thing happened with Ellevation. I can now make change. My voice can be heard. For example, here's a perfect example, today's podcast. On a national level, I have that opportunity to reach and support, because that's the biggest, I think, for me personally, that's the reason I went into education, and to be able to help others. We go back to what I always knew I had to do
Right.
since I was very young, help others. And so to be able to support teachers to find a role in Ellevation in which not only I could use everything I had learned and experienced as a dual language administrator, but then by the same token, use that knowledge now and help people on a national level and support our teachers to help our kids. I thought that was like a perfect combination for me as my next level. And it's been a great opportunity. I've authored strategies for dual language. I love seeing them on Twitter when our teachers post that they do them. It has been fantastic. I do not regret the difference in role is huge, but I don't regret at all having made that change. Simply because, again, we go back to Ellevation is mission driven. And so we, as someone who is guided by a very specific mission as well, I think we aligned well.
I'd say so. We're to say the least, we're very lucky to have you. And a lot of the things that you just said are similar for me, and I have no regrets either. And it's just, I'm so lucky to be able to chat with people like you and amplify your voices. So I'm really glad I asked that question. I thought, is this an appropriate question to ask on this? But I think it absolutely was. So I appreciate you giving us that answer. So last question, this is a question that people know that I ask everybody who comes on. And what we do is we compile a list of books and resources that then we share before folks head off for the summer, so they have a list that they can read if they want to use it. So the question is there a book or a resource that's influenced you either personally or professionally that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. So I've already said that if you need more research on dual language, you've got to read the Guiding Principles for Dual Language Education. I walked around schools with that all the time in my bag, simply because not only does it guide those decisions, but it gives you the research behind it. And so it's a fantastic book, quite adaptable. You can adapt it to your PLCs, to your faculty meetings, to your parent education nights. And then also when you sit down and you plan with your team of leaders at a school. So that's book number one for the field of dual language. And so I've been reading a couple of books, I start reading and then I drop it and then I pick up another book and then I drop that one. And I just keep going back and forth.
Yeah. I know what it's like.
I came across through my work with NABE, because I do a lot of work for NABE, which is, again, National Association of Bilingual Education. And great book for school leaders. It's called Beyond Conversations About Race. And I call it a how-to guide, simply because it's broken up. It aligns so well with me because I mentioned, what does this look like? Is what always guides my decisions. And so this book is one of those, what does it look like? So when you're going to have these difficult conversations, what does that look like? What does that sound like? And how do I even begin, right? And so every chapter is kind of like a how-to, and it's scenario based, which helps a lot when you're building that knowledge base for our teachers to feel confident. The other how-to book that I even gave it to my son, who's a school leader, is Beyond Crisis. And that one was written by 3 incredible researchers. And it's one of those books that came out at the perfect time, right after the pandemic. The now what? We're going back to school, and now what are we going to do? What are we going to face? How are we going to use what we've learned to create stronger school communities and continue this partnership with the community as a whole, which taps into a lot of what we've discussed tonight. And then I just picked up Advancing Equity in Dual Language Education, a Guide for Leaders. I haven't touched that one, but I can tell as I leafed through it that it's going to be one of my favorite books.
Yep.
I'll let you know how that one goes.
Great. So I ask people this question all the time, and they always give me, 2 to 4 books. So you didn't stray from that tradition, which is great. And that's good. We'll link to those so that people can find them. And with that, Sandra, we've had lots of conversations as colleagues, but this has been really eye-opening for me. I've learned a lot. I hope listeners have as well. Really appreciate the work you do. And I'm really glad to call you a colleague here at Ellevation. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been so much fun. Thank you so much for helping me enlighten others, and enlightening me also. I think it's the questions that you ask are very thought-provoking, and sometimes we need that time to kind of reflect on why we do what we do.
I agree.
So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.